You know, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that the government has deposited up to nearly 29,000 pages worth of documents with regards to the SDTC matter to the House of Commons. Now, we've done so in a way that respects the rights of Canadians and respects the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and respects the separation of powers in this place. And I heard earlier today that Andrew Scheer, the Conservative House Leader, had suggested that he knew what was in those documents. And I want to lay that claim to rest because, as everyone knows and has been stated numerous times, members of Parliament didn't request these documents for them to see, so they actually haven't seen any of them. So for him to suggest that he knows the contents of those documents is patently false, and he is simply not telling the truth, because at no point in time were those documents ever to be seen by members of Parliament. Not because that was the government's intention, because that is what members of Parliament asked for. Alors, je veux clarifier que c'est important que tout le monde sache que le gouvernement a déposé jusqu'à 29 000 pages de documents en ce qui concerne la matière de SDTC. Et j'ai écouté le leader de l'opposition dans la Chambre, Andrew Scheer, dire ce matin qu'il sachait ce qui était dans ces documents. Et je dois dire la vérité que ça c'est absolument fausse. Et c'est fausse parce que les membres, les députés ont demandé ces documents non pour que les députés voient ces documents, mais puisqu'ils allaient directement au GRC. Alors s'il y a une députée conservateur qui dit qu'il a vu ces documents ou qui disent qu'il sache qui est dedans, c'est pas vrai, c'est faux complètement parce qu'ils n'ont jamais demandé de voir ces documents. Et je veux dire aussi que le temps est maintenant de terminer avec ces jeux partisans, politiques, de laisser le travail du Chambre continuer parce que les conservateurs ne font pas ces actions sur les principes, sur les principales, sur les valeurs. Ils le font seulement pour faire d'obstruction dans la Chambre. Et les Canadiens méritent mieux que ça, que ce qui fait les députés conservateurs. So it is now time. The government has deposited up to 29,000 pages of documents. The Conservatives are not doing this for any moral or principled reason. It is now time to stop these partisan games, to let the Chamber get back to the important work of Canadians and to get on with the business of governing. Yesterday, the government tabled the supply bills. There is important measures in there for Canadians and for Canada's role in the world. If we do care about seniors and children and people with disabilities accessing the dentist, we need to get on with the business of supply. Today marks 1,000 days since the war of aggression by Russia in Ukraine. If we care about helping Ukrainians, we need to get on with the business of supply. So the time is now up for the Conservatives to stop playing these absolutely ridiculous games and to get on with the business of Canada.
Pour négocier une motion de clôture qui pourrait vous permettre de mettre fin à ces manœuvres. Est-ce que vous avez discuté de ça avec le Bloc ou le NPD?
Comme j'ai dit toujours, j'ai toujours des discussions avec le NPD et avec le Bloc québécois et à discussions productives et constructives, et je vais continuer d'avoir ces discussions.
Est-ce qu'il y a une fenêtre avec la mise à jour économique qui s'en vient? Est-ce que vous pourriez faire un arrangement? On vous donne ceci, vous mettez fin à la pandémie?
J'ai avoir des discussions toujours avec les deux autres partis. Je discute même avec les conservateurs, mais les conversations ne sont pas aussi constructives avec eux.
Your response to those who've asked Minister Boissonnault to resign. What's your response to those who are calling for his resignation?
Look, Minister Boissonnault has been clear with regards to those allegations, and I will let him speak for himself in that regard.
So if you can't... company claimed to be Indigenous when it was not. What message does that send to those who are falsely claiming Indigenous identity in other institutions?
So no one should ever falsely claim an Indigenous identity, and in fact, with regards to that company, they were never on the list for Indigenous procurement.
But the ministers face no consequences, right?
So the minister has addressed those allegations, and the minister will continue to address those.
Just to go back to the lockup right now, if you can't get other parties like the Bloc and the NDP to work with you on a stop motion of this, is that not a de facto non-confidence? I mean, like, it's a minority parliament. You have to work with other parties to a certain
Minority
extent.
parliaments are messy. That's how they are. We have had a period of incredible stability in minority parliaments since 2019, which is abnormal for minority parliaments in Canadian history. But what I can say is just before the privilege motion session started, and actually after it had started, we had won 2 confidence motions, so we do have the confidence of the House. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Canadians right across the country, in particular those Edmontonians in Edmonton Centre and the city I'm from, wake up every single day with the fact that a minister in our country, the Minister of Employment and Social Development in Canada, the minister known as Randy Boissonnault, they continue to see this unfortunate and real-time abuse of the Indigenous procurement system. This abuse has real victims. The victims are Indigenous people. The victims are the good people of Edmonton Centre who are embarrassed by what's taking place here in the House of Commons. Indigenous people aren't just the victims of what happened with Randy Boissonnault. What we're seeing is Indigenous people right across the country are being blamed for calling out what is a very real and legitimate concern, which is that pretendians continue to exist right across our country. This race shifting that's taking place is very concerning. What we're seeing is Indigenous or non-Indigenous people claiming to be Indigenous for the purpose of accessing benefits. We see this right across the country, whether it's in arts and media, whether it's in academia, or whether it's here in the House of Commons. We must get a grapple with the fact that people are abusing these systems for narrow benefit. This is happening across the country. We need to see action when it comes to ensuring the justice for Indigenous people, justice for the good people of Edmonton Centre, and that means Randy Boissonnault must resign. If he does not resign, it's incumbent upon the Prime Minister to kick someone like that out. This is the Prime Minister that said the most important relationship he's ever had is with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Meanwhile, there are those in his cabinet, in his inner circle, that are abusing the Indigenous procurement system so that they can gain advantage and benefit from that system. We're seeing this kind of malicious intent. Right across the country, we need to see a government that's serious and puts the decision-making of who is Indigenous back in the hands of Indigenous communities. This is a matter of self-determination, a matter of reconciliation, and albeit it's become one now of very serious and potential fraud that's stemming up right across the country.
Do you think he should resign as a minister or as an MP?
He must resign. He must resign as a minister. That's someone who is in the cabinet right now making decisions related to the outcome of Indigenous people's lives, who is right now, not certain exactly who he is himself, but he said he's on a soul-searching journey. I am always happy to see my colleagues go on a soul-searching journey. It cannot come at a cost or expense to taxpayers. If that means him resigning in order to find his soul, then he should resign as an MP.
Have you spoken to him since these claims started to come, since questions of his Indigenous links?
I have asked for him to come clean with who he is. Since then, we have not met personally. We have not had a phone call about this. We haven't had any discussion point about this other than my first statement, which was a request to ask him to come clean on who he thinks he is.
The Indigenous Services Minister was asked repeatedly this morning whether she thinks the minister should resign. She didn't answer. Your thoughts on that?
Of course, she's going to say that he shouldn't resign. It's clear that the government is very intent on trying to skirt this under the rug. They're trying tooth and nail to see this issue just go away because they don't want to have to deal with the reality that their government in action, or at times their own party, has created a circumstance where they've tried to perceive or tried to mislead the public in the fact that they have a larger Indigenous caucus than they actually do. So the Liberal Party itself is also guilty of this. It's an institutional guilt. So she belongs to that party. So a party that can't itself even verify who is Indigenous within its own party, then the question is incumbent upon the minister. How seriously do they take reconciliation if they can't answer those questions, the basic questions of that kind of abuse? Because I said before, the real victims here aren't the Liberals. The real victim isn't Randy. The real victim is Indigenous businesses, Indigenous people that did everything right. They did everything right. These are people that I know that built a company for the first time. These are entrepreneurs. They signed all the paperwork. They did all that just to learn that the system is rigged right here at the top.
So for you, apology, it's not enough. I mean, why is an apology maybe not enough for you in your
An apology is not enough because we've had too much of this. We've seen this time and time and time again in Canada. We've seen this issue, whether it was students trying to apply for access to scholarship money under the false name of being Indigenous, whether it's actors who are saying they are someone that they simply are not in order to get prestige, or whether that's a minister in Canada's cabinet that is saying that they are someone for the purposes of accessing a federal procurement strategy and to mislead that federal procurement strategy for the better outcome of their narrow financial request.
What do you make of the minister saying? What do you make of
what do you make of him changing changing his background, saying going from Métis to Cree? Like from your own perspective, what do you make of that?
This is a classic red flag. Anytime we see people shifting, this is why I mentioned this race shifting, this idea that, well, today I'm German, yesterday I'm Cree, and tomorrow I'm going to be Métis, that kind of admission is evidence that someone doesn't know who they are or is trying to cover up a lie they made. These series of lies are hard to defend when we start to see these lies contradict each other. What we've seen in the last few weeks in this very interesting case of pretendingism is a common factor in all cases of pretendingism, which is the fact that we have individuals who are claiming to be someone they aren't, not just the first time, not just the second time, but many times we see this continue the way it is. This isn't just a problem facing Randy Boissonnault. I want to be very clear. This is a problem facing Canada. We have this issue right across the country, in schools, in universities, in businesses, and right here in the House of Commons. It's incumbent upon me, however, as a member who is Métis and has Cree ancestry, to call out what I believe to be a very real abuse. Because I've worked with and I know families that have built companies, and I've seen those companies fall into the ground and go bankrupt because of the lack of economic opportunity. The reason this program is supposed to exist is to ensure Indigenous businesses have a chance to be self-sufficient, can actually do the work of government because they have the meritocracy to do that work. But what we see instead is ministers that are not who they say they are, getting an application to the system, and ultimately getting that contract.
What do you make of the Prime Minister? The Prime Minister was asked today, what do you make of this drip that keeps coming out over Minister Boissonnault? The Prime Minister today was asked, what does he make of Minister Boissonnault? The stories have come out, what Minister Boissonnault has said. The Prime Minister said the minister will continue to explain himself. I'm happy with the work he's doing with Alberta. What do you make of the Prime Minister's, I think that was an expression of somewhat confidence, that he's okay with him staying in the role?
He doesn't take this seriously. This is the same guy that said his most important relationship was that with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Meanwhile, he lets someone who doesn't know who they are pretend to be someone he isn't for the purpose of accessing public dollar. That, to me, is a real pain, and it's a real unfortunate consequence of the continued colonization and systemic racism we continue to see in Canada. That kind of systemic racism is perpetuating by people in power who do not act. Systemic violence like this, a systemic violence that suggests that you don't have to be Indigenous to apply for an Indigenous grant and you won't even get a slap on the wrist, says to every other person who is a pretending right now and to everyone else who wants to access the benefit on behalf of Indigenous people that they can get away with it and there's going to be no consequence. That is the exact opposite of what reconciliation means in Canada. We need to have more effort towards Indigenous justice, and that includes taking seriously the very real issues that are facing Indigenous communities. Pretendingism is taking jobs, opportunity, wealth, and voice away from Indigenous people in a very legitimate way. We could have been talking the last 3 weeks about Indigenous self-determination. Instead, we've been stuck talking about Randy Boissonnault and how a case like his is detrimental to the system, and there are ways to remedy this. The very first step, the Prime Minister has to kick him out of Cabinet.
One last question. So you had already touched on this a little bit before about the Liberals Indigenous caucus. There's at least 2 other MPs on there who have publicly been questioned about their claims to indigeneity. Do you think that Jaime Batiste, the chair of that caucus, has said that politics is a numbers game and that the more people he has in that committee who can advocate on things that he finds valuable is great to him? Do you think that that caucus is working in the best interests of Indigenous people?
Politics is a numbers game. I agree with him on that. What I don't agree with is that he's willing to use Indigenous people as a pawn in his game to get numbers. That's the problem with the Liberal Party. They're using Indigenous people as a token. It doesn't matter how many Indigenous people vote for my party, and it shouldn't matter how many Indigenous people vote for the Liberal Party to know that abusing a system that takes money out of the hands of Indigenous people is wrong, completely wrong. When I think about my colleagues across the House of Commons, I am concerned with pretendingism, not just in the Liberal Party, but across all parties in the House of Commons. We've done the work in my party as an Indigenous caucus to make certain we know who we are, to make certain we understand those stories, and to share those stories of pride of who we are with all of our caucus members. That's a difficult job. And I have a huge amount of respect for my colleagues that have asked those hard questions of me and my colleagues, and we tell them and we speak truth to who we are. I am a proud Métis person. My father was from the Frog Lake First Nations. I am from the Fishing Lake Métis settlement. I have a card in my pocket. I fought for rights for my people for 6 years as a national director, and I find it shameful that people in this place would use Indigenous identity in order to score either cheap political points or to score money. Thank you very much. Procurement projects, federal procurement projects that would allow you to get hundreds of thousands of dollars under the false pretense of being Indigenous. He's claiming that he had no awareness of Mr. Anderson's business dealings and that Mr. Anderson acted unilaterally. That is the claim he's making. We have a very difficult challenge, which is how do we verify that claim? Regardless of its verifiability, he was the joint owner of that company that submitted those applications. Ultimately, that company would receive federal contributions. That's the issue today. The larger issue that you're speaking about on Indigenous identity is one that the country's having in real time across the whole country. But it's separate and distinct from the fact that a cabinet minister would lie on an application, have that application heard, even though those applications didn't receive funding at the time, those applications are kept and that company's portfolio are kept through the procurement process, and eventually he did get money through that procurement process. That's the issue here. If this was an innocent white lie and it was just on a school website or like some low risk thing where someone said, I'm just discovering my identity, it would be more acceptable. The fact that we had a sitting cabinet minister in the chair of power in our country that's committed to reconciliation but can't even see how damaging and incredibly racist it is to have an application in false name of a nation when you do not belong to that nation or don't have certainty of that, to me, is perception, is misleading the public, and it's a perception that he wanted to have in order to gain a contract. That's the issue.
Should he resign?
He should resign.
Thanks, Blake.
Thanks so much. We'll see you there, hopefully. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. Oh, you see me there.
Yeah. Well, Gazan, what do you make of a little bit of what you've read about Minister Boissonnault, what he has talked about in terms of his family's connection to Indigenous ancestry? He apologized last week. Do you have any thoughts of kind of what you've heard from him?
Well, I know that people in Canada have been charged for identity fraud. I haven't looked into his ancestry. I certainly don't have the time to look into his ancestry, but claiming you're something you're not is fraud.
What do you make of his
That's certainly not up to me. I would say that he has a number of issues right now, and that's all I have to say about that.
What do you make of the explanation, which is he was speaking from what he thought to be true about his family's ancestry. He's learning about things in real time. He was not maybe as clear as he should have been, but he never intended to claim an Indigenous identity that wasn't his. What do you make of that explanation to the statements you've heard from him?
Well, the fact is he did claim Indigenous ancestry. He participated in a company that applied for funding at a time where we're supposed to be reconciling in this country, claiming Indigenous ancestry, and I think that's very serious.
If the caucus and the cabinet are having these conversations about Indigenous identity and there's no consensus within about what that is, do you think that they could be expected to properly handle the procurement list, the Indigenous business registry, if they can't figure it out within their own ring?
Well, I want to be really clear. That's a really important program. I know that members of the Conservative Party have criticized that program. I think probably because that's another thing they'd probably cut if they were elected. However, they need a more thorough process of vetting. People that are applying for the program. That's certainly what's happening in academic institutions across the country now with all the identity fraud that's occurred.
Well, what's your reaction to him changing from what's your reaction to him changing from conflicting statements from Cree to Métis? And what does that do? What does that make of the Indigenous ancestry?
Well, certainly it's not up to me. It's up to him to be honest about his identity. Claiming your identity is something that it isn't. Now that it's shifting, That's identity fraud, and there's people in this country that are being charged with identity fraud right now for claiming Indigenous ancestry when they aren't.
Moi, j'avais une question sur le rapport qui est sorti ce matin, selon lequel 35% des immigrants francophones quittent le Canada au bout de plusieurs années. On ne réussit pas à les retenir. Quelles leçons il faut tirer de cette conclusion-là? Et puis, quelle stratégie, quelles mesures pourraient être mises en place pour avoir une meilleure rétention?
Bien, d'un, je veux lire le rapport au complet. Il y a beaucoup de spéculation dans le rapport. Je ne veux pas minimiser quand même les conclusions. La réalité, c'est que l'intégration, c'est l'affaire de tous, là, que ce soit les particuliers ou les villes, les provinces, territoires et le Canada. On sait aussi que, qu'on soit immigrant ou non, il y a des pôles d'attraction au Canada, que ce soit Toronto, Montréal, les grandes villes, là où on peut décrocher un beau salaire. Un bon gage d'intégration, c'est d'avoir un bon job, puis de pouvoir payer pour le coût de la vie, etc. C'est vrai aussi qu'on soit anglophone, francophone, il y a beaucoup de mobilité au sein des nouveaux arrivants. Souvent, c'est des gens très spécialisés qui peuvent autant se déplacer aux États-Unis, en Europe, en France, en Angleterre. Donc, ils ont attendu longtemps pour avoir leur citoyenneté, mais ils partent pour un autre job. Ça, c'est aussi la réalité. Ce qui me préoccupe le plus, c'est surtout, ça me préoccupe comme phénomène, mais aussi le fait qu'on fait beaucoup d'efforts d'attirer des gens d'expression française ici au Canada. Dans mon rôle, dans ma juridiction, de m'assurer que ce soit dans les communautés en dehors du Québec, c'est souvent, plus souvent que non, des petites régions rurales. Donc, il y a peut-être l'attrait d'autres lieux au Canada. Et ceux qui quittent le Québec, évidemment, c'est une question d'intégration au Québec. Je ne veux pas spéculer, mais la rhétorique contre les immigrants qui peut planer, surplomber la rhétorique, le discours politique pendant ces dernières années ne peut pas aider, mais encore il faut des faits pour le prouver. C'est sûr que les gens qui parlent français veulent s'établir au Québec, dans des régions où ils peuvent être accueillis, peuvent passer leur vie en français, que ce soit dans la partie francophone de l'Ontario, dans la péninsule acadienne ou dans d'autres régions du pays. Donc, c'est un devoir de tous. L'effort qu'on essaie de faire dans notre ministère, c'est de s'assurer que les gens qui les accueillent ont les ressources. Il y a une limite aux efforts que peut déployer le fédéral, mais pour accueillir ces gens. Donc, j'ai deux projets pilotes francophones, projet pilote rural et nordique, qui ont quand même des taux de rétention d'à peu près qui frisent les 80 %. Donc, c'est réussi. Mais à plusieurs égards, on rame à contre-courant.
Qu'est-ce que vous pensez de l'idée d'avoir une cible de rétention? C'est une idée qui était lancée par cet organisme-là, l'Institut de la citoyenneté canadienne. Ils disent, en même temps qu'on dévoile les cibles des niveaux des résidents permanents et maintenant résidents temporaires, on devrait avoir des cibles de rétention.
Oui, peut-être. Moi, ma cible qui me préoccupe le plus, c'est le 10 % que j'ai visé pour la migration francophone. Dans le passé, on a, de peine et de misère, atteint le 3-4 %. Là, on atteint plus que 6 % cette année de migration francophone en dehors du Québec, c'est-à-dire en plus de ce que le Québec assume dans sa juridiction. Donc, c'est pas rien. C'est un objectif que je veux accomplir. J'ai su accomplir le 4 plus %, le 6 cette année. Alors, on vise le 10 %. C'est pas rien. Mais il y a plusieurs efforts d'intégration qui doivent se déployer, surtout dans les juridictions des provinces qui sont responsables des services en éducation, services évidemment en santé et bien évidemment le logement.
Quelle évaluation vous faites de l'Ontario? Le rapport parle plutôt de l'Ontario et du Québec, les immigrants francophones. Quelle évaluation vous faites de ces deux provinces-là par rapport à l'intégration? Est-ce qu'ils en font suffisamment pour les francophones, selon vous?
Bien, je pense que dans la période de 3 décennies qui a caractérisé la relation qu'on a avec le Québec, avec l'entente Canada-Québec, on a parfois la tendance à minimiser l'impact de cet accord, mais cet accord a eu un impact significatif sur la capacité d'attirer au Québec des francophones. Donc, il y a beaucoup de réussites. Il y a aussi des difficultés, évidemment, mais je pense que c'est un bon exemple d'une fédération comme le Canada qui appuie ma nation du Québec en s'assurant qu'on ait la langue commune française depuis 3 décennies. Donc, il y a beaucoup de réussite à cet égard, même si quand on le compare aux années 80, aux années 70, c'est de l'histoire assez récente quand même. Donc, des bonnes nouvelles. Je crois aussi que, en ce qui a trait aux autres provinces, surtout le Nouveau-Brunswick qui a un caractère bilingue, qui a un mandat bilingue. Il y a plus d'efforts à faire. Je n'étais pas nécessairement réconforté par le comportement du gouvernement précédent, Higgs. J'ai beaucoup plus d'espoir maintenant, mais c'est inégal, pour être poli.
Avec Karine Gould de Québec solidaire qui dit que le gouvernement caquiste casse du sucre sur le dos des immigrants, qu'il y a du racisme à l'Assemblée nationale. Êtes-vous d'accord avec ces propos?
J'ai pas entendu ce qu'il dit. J'ai dit à plusieurs égards que je considérais que M. Legault a de temps à autre cassé du sucre sur les immigrants pour ses propres motifs politiques, mais je ne vais pas m'avancer davantage là-dessus.
Vous avez pas entendu les propos de M. Boissy?
Non. Non.
Vous avez pas...
Non, moi, je fais d'autres choses dans la vie que d'écouter ce qui se passe à l'Assemblée nationale.
Est-ce que vous pensez, parce que vous avez fait mention de rhétorique dans les 2 dernières années, est-ce que vous pensez que le langage qui est employé au Parlement et ou par le gouvernement du Québec...
Non, j'accuse personne aujourd'hui d'être raciste.
Does Canada need a dedicated immigrant retention strategy with more...
I can't hear you clearly.
Does Canada need a dedicated immigrant retention strategy with more economic and francophone immigrants leaving by proportion?
You know, I think we do to some extent. Are you doing it perfectly? I think the answer is no to that. A lot of pilot projects, I'm reversing my words, sorry, are dedicated towards northern communities. Those have retention rates of over 80%, as I said to your colleague in French. Those are important, but they're new, and they're smaller in numbers than our larger flow, which is based on, 60% of it is basically based on people getting skills. We are currently, and this is a new thing, giving more points to people that can speak French, notably to make sure that we can hit what I announced 2 weeks ago, which is a 10% target on making sure Francophones get here. But bringing an immigrant to the country doesn't stop or end at the border. It's making sure that they have a good job, making sure that they are getting the proper services, housing, and being able that they can get along in their new country. That requires the jurisdictions that are important for exercising those jurisdictions to implement welcoming strategies so that they can retain those people. There's a phenomenon in Canada, in countries like Canada, that places like Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver naturally pull people towards them out of the regions. So that's something that we're always fighting against. But obviously we don't want them to leave the country. And what we are seeing with people that are recent arrivals to Canada, because of the skills that they have and what they can contribute to the economy, is they're also highly mobile. So they've waited a long time to become a citizen. They become a citizen and perhaps they get a job elsewhere. Those are stats that we still need to measure. I don't want to deny the mobility of those people because it's a right, but it's also a fact that we tend to attract people that have the skills and capacity and the ability to move. And so, it's something that comes with a bit of a conundrum, but I think it is something that we continuously work to retain. We've seen large migrations of population to Canada in the last few years. I wouldn't say that we're having a bad job retaining people by that stretch of the argument.
Le rapport parle beaucoup de l'Ontario, vous dites le Québec. Il y a 2 semaines, vous avez dit l'Ontario reste assis sur son steak. Vous avez dit ça par rapport au secteur postsecondaire. Mais par rapport à l'immigration francophone, quelle évaluation vous faites de l'Ontario, surtout avec ce rapport-là?
C'est moyen, honnêtement. Honnêtement, c'est moyen. Vous avez vu les sous-investissements dans les institutions francophones, notamment. Je pense qu'il y a de la bonne volonté de la part du gouvernement, mais il n'y a pas de cash qui suit. Donc, j'estime encore que ça soit sur le steak.
The CBSA has recovered more vehicles this year than it has last year. Equite says auto theft has still increased, costing $1.5 billion in 2023. What enforcement measures have been successful, but what else needs to be done to address them?
You are 100% correct that we need to continue to keep the pedal to the metal in terms of ensuring that the rates of auto theft come down. They've come down by 19%. The CBSA has recovered approximately 2,000 vehicles. We need to do more. And so we are pressing auto manufacturers to ensure that they are taking measures in the manufacturing process to deter auto thefts from happening. Those are measures that auto manufacturers themselves can take without regulation. On top of that, we have completed our consultations on regulation, and I am pressing my department at the Ministry of Transport to conclude the review of the consultations and to publish regulations early in the new year. So those are 2 items on the auto manufacturing side that I have been working on diligently. In addition to that, we need to address the issue of revinning. And I have written to all of the provinces and territories, my counterparts in those jurisdictions, to encourage them to partake in the process of tracking VIN numbers so that we can also ensure that revinning, which is criminal, should not and will not occur.
The last time those auto regulations were updated was 2007, so are you saying that Canadians have to wait until the new year, until new regulations?
I'm saying that every day I'm pressing my department to conclude their review of the consultations which occurred over the summer, and that should be forthcoming right away. But I am also saying that auto manufacturers do not need to wait for the regulations. If they see a societal problem, like we are all seeing relating to the theft of vehicles, they themselves can take measures to implement and insert deterrent mechanisms in the process of manufacturing vehicles so that auto theft is more difficult to undertake. In other words, the problem should not only be on consumers. Auto manufacturers themselves have to say, what can we do as an industry to ensure that vehicles that we produce are harder to sell? And the federal government will continue to do our part. We've invested in the CBSA. We have invested in scanners. We are ensuring that the criminal code has been amended with more severe penalties for auto theft. And we have also undertaken bail reform under Bill C-48. Now we need provincial jurisdictions to step up in the area of enforcing bail reform that we've already enacted. We need provincially appointed judges and justice of the peace to enforce the bail provisions that we have provided in law. And we also need investments in the administration of justice. That's at the provincial level. We need the provinces to make sure detention centres and jails are not overcrowded. There's more space so that justices and judges who are considering bail do not simply let offenders and repeat offenders off because there's no room in the jails. And that's within the provincial area of jurisdiction. The federal government is doing its part, amending the criminal code, amending bail reform, and ensuring now that we are coming forward with revised regulations for the auto industry. And we are saying it takes every level of government and stakeholders across the board to do their part, and that includes the auto manufacturing industry.
What do you think should happen with Minister Boissonnault? Should he stay in cabinet?
I know Randy Boissonnault to be an extremely hardworking, dedicated and responsible member of Parliament and member of the executive branch of government, and I look forward to continuing to work with him. Thank you.
Thank you. Un chemin Roxham 2.0 comme ce dont parle M. Legault?
Je pense que M. Legault doit arrêter de faire peur aux gens. Le chemin Roxham est fermé depuis 18 mois parce qu'on a une entente sur les tiers pays sûrs avec les Américains qui fonctionne très bien. Cette voie d'accès qui était une échappatoire dans la frontière avec le Canada est fermée depuis déjà plus qu'1 an. Et on va continuer à faire ce que la GRC fait depuis déjà plusieurs semaines, d'être présent à la frontière, se préparer à tout. Mais de travailler respectueusement aussi.
Ce que M. Legault dit, c'est qu'on ne peut pas s'en permettre un chemin Roxham 2.0. Des fois, c'est d'accord avec lui de dire qu'on ne peut pas se le permettre pour les services sociaux, etc.
Mais là, le chemin Roxham, il est fermé, là. Il n'existe plus. Je pense qu'il y a une personne par mois ou par semaine, peut-être, qui traverse, et c'est souvent meilleur du côté nord vers le côté sud. Alors c'est essentiellement là, un sujet du passé. Évidemment, ce que M. Legault dit peut-être, c'est qu'il faut se préparer à la prochaine présidence du président Trump. Et ça, on le fait depuis déjà plusieurs mois, depuis plusieurs années. C'est un enjeu qui n'est pas nouveau.
Et parlant du passé, je vais parler de Poste Canada, donc peut-être le modèle est dépassé. Est-ce qu'il y a un virage qui doit s'opérer obligatoirement à Poste Canada quand on regarde d'autres services postaux gouvernementaux, des sociétés d'État qui se sont diversifiés au fil des années? Est-ce qu'il y a un virage prévu?
Le mot diversification est effectivement le mot-clé. Poste Canada doit diversifier ses services au cours des prochaines années. Le modèle de l'année 1980 ne fonctionne évidemment plus en 2024. La direction le sait très bien, est en discussion avec ses avec ses employés qui sont essentiels évidemment au travail de Poste Canada pour non seulement régler la crise que nous avons présentement, mais nous préparer pour le futur de Poste Canada.
Est-ce qu'il y a des modèles, vous, qui vous parlent, par exemple, de s'associer avec des Amazon ou d'offrir même des services bancaires via Poste Canada? Est-ce qu'il y a des modèles qui vous parlent?
Il y a des modèles que Poste Canada a en tête. Ils sont en discussion avec leurs employés, leurs partenaires pour voir comment faire. Effectivement, il faut y avoir des partenariats avec d'autres entreprises pour assurer la présence de Poste Canada. Poste Canada est important non seulement pour livrer des colis et des lettres, mais c'est important aussi pour servir les communautés plus éloignées, les communautés rurales, qui ont moins accès à d'autres services de livraison de colis que d'autres milieux au Canada.
At what point should this go to binding arbitration?
We are not talking of anything of that sort. We are, as Minister MacKinnon has said clearly, we're asking the parties to sit at the table. There is now a mediator, which is going to be of significant help in the next few days. To have them sit at the table and find a solution.
Est-ce que ça pourrait devenir une option sur la table?
Ce que nous demandons maintenant, et le ministre MacKinnon a été très clair, c'est que les parties s'assoient à la table et trouvent une solution négociée.
Monsieur Duclos, qu'est-ce que vous avez pensé? Qu'est-ce que vous avez?
Canada Post, you talked about diversification of the business model. Are you sitting at the table with the leadership at Canada Post right now to discuss how that can change?
Obviously not in the current context. They are obviously very busy with the unions to try to find a negotiated solution. But for months and years, in fact, they know that their model is not a model of the future. They need to adjust the way they work, the way they deliver parcels and letters across Canada.
Will you change the mandate? Are you open to changing the mandate that Canada Post has for them to operate as a more, say, profitable business?
Their mandate will remain to serve Canadians wherever Canadians may live. We know that...
Is that flexible? I mean, they've been doing that for decades.
They can, obviously they will be adjusting and adapting to the ongoing reality of letters not being so important anymore, the competition which is fierce in the package delivery market. So they need to address those circumstances.
En tant que lieutenant du Québec, M. Duclos, qu'est-ce que vous avez pensé de l'affaire d'Arun-Boisy? Est-ce qu'il devrait s'excuser, selon vous?
Ben ça, c'est la relève des choses de l'Assemblée nationale. Il y a déjà assez de choses à traiter ici à la Chambre des communes. On va laisser un peu de travail aussi aux gens de l'Assemblée nationale.
Je ne préférerais pas commenter là-dessus.
You added more properties to the land bank today. I'm wondering if you can share if there's been any concern about a lack of interest in those that were already added previously before the ones that announced today.
Quite the contrary. There's been very significant interest, over 300 inquiries on the bank that was available until today. Obviously, some of these properties are going to move faster than others because they're the better position. They are in a market where demand is higher, in a place where there are many more partners that are interested in developing those properties. But we are very inclusive. We're including the maximum number of properties available so that every community in Canada has an opportunity to use them. Merci beaucoup.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. I'm Don Davies. I'm the New Democrat finance critic, and I'm joined by my colleague Alexandra Bouleris, who is our deputy leader and our housing critic. Last month, some alarming statistics came out from Stats Canada that showed that the price of food was up over 20% in September of this year compared to where it was 3 years ago. Today, we got some more alarming numbers that show that the price of rent is up 21% this October over where it was 3 years ago. When you dig into the numbers, it's even more concerning because the inflation increases in rent, in shelter, and in food all vastly exceed the headline rate of 2% inflation. So what does that mean? That means Canadians who are already struggling and paying stratospheric prices for their shelter, for their rent, for their food, are seeing the prices increase. And it also shows that what the Liberals are doing is not working because the inflationary increases are still exceeding the target rate set by the Bank of Canada. Now, the Conservatives will just make it worse. So we know that they have no solutions other than to propose cuts. As the person who helped to negotiate the dental care program, I know that the Conservatives cutting dental care will cost your average family thousands of dollars a year. So at a time when Canadians are really struggling, when they're really suffering, where they need relief that they're not getting from Liberal government, they certainly will not find any solutions in Conservatives who will just exacerbate that problem and make things worse. So the NDP, we have announced, I think, a very bold and effective proposal in the last couple of days. Our leader, Jagmeet Singh, announced that the NDP will cut the GST on a number of things, starting with home heating, particularly important, I think, as Canadians enter the winter season, where the heating costs of their homes are going to rise significantly. We'll take the GST off of children's clothing. We'll take it off food. We'll take it off diapers. This, I think we calculate, will provide relief of about $500 per family at a time when Canadians really need it. So at a time when all they see from Liberals are increased costs, at a time when Canadians, all they see from Conservatives is cuts that will make their life harder, the NDP is proposing real policies that will actually provide them with relief now. So I'll now turn this over to my colleague Alexandre Boulris, who can give his remarks in French.
Merci beaucoup, Don. Donc, Alexandre Boulris, député de Rosemont, la petite patrie. Écoutez, s'il y a des gens qui pensaient que l'augmentation du coût de la vie était sous contrôle, on a bien mauvaises nouvelles qui nous arrivent de Statistique Canada. En fait, on remarque que c'est à la hausse, et c'est à la hausse sur des items qui sont cruciaux, qui sont fondamentaux dans la vie des gens. Ce qu'on a vu, c'est que, en moyenne, le prix de la nourriture a augmenté de 20 % dans les 3 dernières années. Le prix des loyers a augmenté de 21 %. C'est des choses que les gens ne peuvent pas couper ou très difficilement en se mettant dans des positions de pauvreté. Alors, c'est extrêmement inquiétant. Et ce qu'on remarque, c'est que les solutions des libéraux, ils n'existent pas. Il n'y a rien qui fonctionne. Les gens continuent d'en arracher. Et si jamais c'était par malheur les conservateurs, mais là, ils couperaient dans les services dont les familles ont besoin, ils couperaient dans les pensions, ils couperaient dans les prestations pour enfants, ils couperaient les soins dentaires aux aînés puis aux adolescents, puis ça ferait encore plus mal aux gens. Alors, on est face à une situation qui est une crise qui est très grave pour plusieurs personnes, plusieurs familles. Puis nous, au NPD, ce qu'on met de l'avant, ce que Jagmeet Singh a proposé, c'est qu'on enlève la TPS sur des produits essentiels, des produits de base, de première nécessité. Alors, sur tout ce qui est la nourriture, les couches, les vêtements pour enfants, les factures de chauffage, dont Hydro-Québec. Les factures d'Internet puis de cellulaire aussi, qui sont parmi les plus chères du G20. En ce moment, les gens ont besoin d'aide, les gens en arrachent. Puis ça, c'est une position très concrète, une solution très concrète que le NPD, nous, on met de l'avant. On espère que le gouvernement va être à l'écoute des besoins des gens, parce que les Québécois puis les Canadiens ont besoin d'un break, puis en ce moment, ils ne l'ont pas, malheureusement.
Monsieur Boulris, on veut vous entendre sur l'affaire de Arun Boisy, s'il vous plaît. Qu'est-ce que vous en pensez? Est-ce qu'il devrait s'excuser pour ses propos? Est-ce que le traitement qui lui est réservé est juste?
Écoutez, c'est pas à moi à dire un député de l'Assemblée nationale quoi dire puis quoi faire. Je pense que M. Boisy a reconnu qu'il avait été maladroit. Je pense qu'il y avait beaucoup de maladresse dans la manière qu'il s'est exprimé. En même temps, il y a eu aussi un acharnement médiatique de certains chroniqueurs sur ses propos. J'ai l'impression qu'on l'a politisé, on a monté des choses en épingle pour créer une crise vraiment gigantesque depuis plusieurs jours. Mais sur le fond de l'affaire, ce qui est vrai, c'est qu'il y a des chroniqueurs puis il y a des partis politiques qui utilisent les réfugiés ou les immigrants comme des boucs émissaires. Vous savez, si on n'a pas construit de logement social depuis 30 ans, c'est pas à cause de la personne qui vient d'arriver puis de franchir la frontière. Si on a de la moisissure dans nos écoles, c'est pas à cause de la personne qui vient du Mexique pour essayer de trouver une job ici. Si il y a de l'attente dans l'hôpital, à la salle d'urgence, c'est pas à cause de la personne qui vient d'Afrique avec sa famille pour essayer d'avoir une nouvelle vie. Alors, c'est qui les responsables de la détérioration des services publics? Mais c'est les gouvernements, depuis 20 ans puis 30 ans, ici les libéraux puis les conservateurs, qui ont abandonné le logement social, qui ont abandonné la construction de coopératives depuis 1994. C'est pas le demandeur d'asile qui vient d'arriver dont c'est la faute.
Le gouvernement a reconnu, même Justin Trudeau a fait une vidéo, reconnaît, puis vous parlez aujourd'hui des chiffres sur l'inflation, la hausse des loyers qui est incroyable encore. Même le gouvernement libéral fait un lien maintenant avec l'immigration. Je voulais savoir, est-ce que le NPD constate quand même qu'il y a un impact de l'immigration sur l'économie, sur les services sociaux? Et comment est-ce que vous aborderiez cette façon-là, ces impacts-là au niveau politique?
On peut toujours, puis il faut toujours avoir une discussion sur les seuils d'immigration, qui on accepte, comment on les accepte, avec quelle rigueur aussi, dans quel processus. C'est des discussions qui ont lieu dans n'importe quel pays au monde, dans n'importe quelle démocratie. Ce que je constate, par contre, c'est un sous-financement des services publics chronique depuis des années, pour lequel on ne peut pas blâmer ni les immigrants ni les réfugiés. Puis deuxièmement, bien, le fait qu'on a tendance à pointer du doigt, certaines personnes ont tendance à pointer du doigt les personnes qui viennent d'arriver ici, comme s'ils étaient responsables de la crise du logement, comme s'ils étaient responsables des difficultés de langue française, par exemple. Puis il y a des politiciens qui ont été extrêmement clairs dans le fait de dire c'est 100% de la faute aux immigrants s'il y a une crise du logement.
Je m'excuse, parce que depuis tantôt, vous dites qu'il y a des partis politiques qui causent du sucre sur le dos aux immigrants. Vous parlez de qui?
Bien, je pense que le premier ministre du Québec, François Legault, a été clair en disant que la crise du logement était la faute des immigrants, ce qui est totalement faux. On se rappelle du ministre du Travail, M. Jean Boulet, qui a dit « Les gens viennent au Québec, ils refusent de travailler puis ils refusent d'apprendre le français », ce qui est quand même assez extraordinaire de la part d'un gouvernement qui coupe les cours de francisation pour les immigrants alors qu'il y a des listes d'attente et que les gens veulent apprendre le français.
Considérez-vous qu'il y a du racisme à l'Assemblée nationale?
Je pense qu'il y a du racisme dans n'importe quelle société. Je ne pense pas qu'aucune institution démocratique l'est. Je ne pointe pas du doigt aucune personne non plus pour faire des accusations comme ça, qui sont quand même des accusations graves. Ce que je dis par contre, c'est qu'il y a une tendance très claire à pointer du doigt et à blâmer les immigrants pour un paquet de problèmes pour lesquels ils ne sont pas du tout responsables.
Par rapport à votre annonce aujourd'hui, le gouvernement ils ont fait une demande supplémentaire de 21 milliards de dollars pour des projets dont le NPD ils supportent. Est-ce que le parti serait en support de mettre fin au débat de privilèges pour faire passer la demande, encore une fois, pour des programmes dont votre parti supporte?
Écoutez, en ce moment, ce qu'on voit à la Chambre, c'est assez déplorable. C'est vraiment presque une garderie parfois. Mais les libéraux ne sont pas transparents, puis ils ne fournissent pas des documents avec l'essentiel des informations. Avoir des documents qui sont complètement caviardés, ce n'est pas responsable. Puis deuxièmement, on a des conservateurs qui font de l'obstruction systématique, qui refusent de voter leur propre motion, puis qui font des amendements puis des sous-amendements pour retarder les travaux. Moi, je le dis, qu'ils s'arrangent, qui se parlent, puis qui trouvent des solutions, puis après, on ira de l'avant avec des propositions qui sont importantes pour les Québécois et les Canadiens.
Mais vous autres, vous êtes...
J'ai pas eu la chance.
L'accord de libre-échange États-Unis, Mexique, Canada,
oui.
Est-ce que le Canada devrait considérer ou devrait avoir des négociations pour un accord avec les États-Unis qui exclurait le Mexique, comme le suggèrent les premiers ministres de l'Ontario et de l'Alberta?
Bien, pour ces technicalités-là, je vais laisser notre porte-parole en matière de commerce international répondre là-dessus. Une chose est sûre, c'est que nous, ce qu'on demande au gouvernement libéral, c'est deux choses. Premièrement, qui travaille pour maintenir des bons emplois au Canada puis au Québec, des bons emplois syndiqués. Puis la deuxième chose, mais qui travaille aussi pour défendre la gestion de l'offre pour nos agriculteurs du Québec. Pour nous autres, c'est une priorité. Merci.
Sorry? Can we have questions in English? Sure. Because all things in French. Just in follow-up, I don't know how your French is, but I can ask again.
Sure.
Okay, sure. So in the House right now, yesterday, the government tabled a supplementary bill for $21 billion to put money for programs that the NDP supports, like the food housing program and the dental care program and such. Obviously, you can't pass that right now, given what's happening in the House. So would the party support a stop motion to end the debate, to see those programs through that the NDP does support?
Well, we'll have to study anything that's put before the House, as our leader, Jagmeet Singh, has said ever since we tore up the confidence and supply agreement, is that we're here to do what's best for Canadians, and we'll look on a case-by-case basis at whatever's put before the House. I mean, right now, we've been tied up for 3 weeks in conservative kindergarten tactics, where nothing is being done, where we can't move forward on any of the important economic issues that are facing Canadians, and the Liberals have proved unable to respond. I mean, particularly because Liberals refuse to hand over documents. So you've got pox on both their houses. The Liberals are not being transparent, and they're not listening to the will of Parliament. And you have the Conservatives responding by playing games so that nothing gets done. The NDP doesn't think that either of those two routes are the proper way to go.
Right. So with that in mind, then, the Liberals, with the NDP's votes, could put a stop to this right now. And you didn't say yes, the party would support that, although I understand. But is that, in a sense, not a de facto non-confidence, given that the government can't put through spending bills or spending money to see programs and services through?
No, you know, the one thing I've learned in politics is not to comment on hypotheticals, you know, what they might do and whether it might be a confidence. I mean, you know, we're here waiting to see the Liberals table a fall economic statement. That's what Canadians want to see, is a credible economic plan that'll help them with what Canadians don't care about this kind of nonsense that's going on in Parliament or the nursery rhyme slogans of the Conservatives. They want real economic policies put before the House of Commons that'll bring them relief. That's why the NDP, what are we talking about? Taking the GST off things like internet and cellular services. It'll save people money right away. We're talking about how do we pay for things and get revenue to government. We're talking about a windfall profits tax on corporations that are making out like bandits. These are core economic policies that we want debated in the House of Commons. And we'll do everything we can to get those real issues debated on the floor of the House of Commons. Whether the Liberals, the Liberals could end this tomorrow by producing the documents. If they refuse to do so, that's what I call them to. They want to move forward. Tell them to produce the documents that Parliament has demanded.
Discussions for the fall economic statement. Is it something coming for you guys, you think, in there?
Yeah, take a look at the NDP 2021 platform and start implementing some of those economic policies that will really bring relief to Canadians. Build, the kind of affordable housing that Canadians need. Start bringing some fairness to our tax system. Start creating good family-sustaining jobs in this country. This is the core beliefs of the NDP. These are the things that made the foundation of our platform from 2021, and this is what I would urge all of my colleagues in the House of Commons to get to work and deliver for Canadians.
Good afternoon. My name's Gord Johns. I'm the mental health and harm reduction critic for the federal NDP. And here today I'm here to speak about the CMHA, the Canadian Mental Health Association report on the state of mental health in Canada. And what we learned again is that the Liberals continue to let Canadians down. And we know that the Conservatives will cut services to Canadians. The report was scathing. It identified that over 2.5 million Canadians can't access the mental health care they need because they can't afford it. We have a two-tiered healthcare system, and we need universality when it comes to mental and physical health. There's still no parity, despite the fact that we've tabled legislation and given the Liberal government a blueprint on how to achieve that. They also identified the government's failed broken promises. There's no permanent funding when it comes to mental health delivery, and young people are disproportionately impacted. Over 57% of young people can't access supports. As I cited earlier, 2.5 million Canadians can't access mental health supports. That's triple what it was pre-pandemic levels. So the government needs to take leadership. Also, it depends where you live in Canada. It's disproportionate about where you can access services. There's only 5 psychiatrists in all of the 3 territories put together, 8 in PEI. In British Columbia, my home province, for example, there's 747. So whether you're in rural Canada or northern Canada, it is very difficult to get the support you need. And we need universality. Also, we saw provinces and territories on average spending 6.3% of their overall healthcare budgets. When we look to our OECD partners, the average is 12%. There's no set plan for Canada to achieve the 12% spending on mental health care in Canada, and the costs are enormous to society. The report identifies opportunities. They highlight some really successful models that need to be scaled up. But overall, the Liberals continue to let Canadians down, and we know the Conservatives' plan is to cut healthcare and cut supports to Canadians. The report is lengthy. There are 24 recommendations. I won't get into all of them today, but I'm happy to take your questions. What we do need is an urgent response to the government to treat the mental health and the toxic drug crisis like an emergency. They need to lay out a plan on how they're going to deliver services to Canadians to make sure that we have parity with mental and physical health. But clearly, stigma is the root cause of why we don't have a care system in place to support people that are struggling and in need the most. I'll take your questions.
Yesterday, the government tabled a $21 billion supplemental appropriation bill. Some of the programs that would support are programs the NDP supports, like dental care and housing and so on. If the NDP is not willing to support a stop motion to the privilege debate, how can the NDP say that it continues to support the government if it doesn't put a stop to that to see appropriation spending like those programs go through?
Well, we're going to take a look at everything individually, bill by bill. When it comes to supply, we are also going to look at that as well. But right now we're being very clear that if they're not going to put things on the table and in the window that are going to help Canadians, we can't support it. Here we are talking today about the state of mental health in Canada, and we're in a situation that is absolutely horrific. This is a crisis that's happening. 2.5 million Canadians can't access health care because this Liberal government let Canadians down. They failed in delivering their promises. The Conservatives, we know, are going to cut mental health care. What we need is the federal government to commit to delivering parity. How are we going to get to parity? How are they going to make sure that provinces and territories are going to be held accountable when it comes to transfers and spending? And if we enshrine it into law, we need, my bill C-414, which calls for adding parity to the Mental Health Care Act, making sure that it's actually law, and making sure that we have a timeline and plan on how we're going to achieve that. We're not going to get there without that kind of commitment from the federal government. So that's what we're looking for. We need the Liberals to come forward with the sense of urgency when it comes to the mental health care and the toxic drug crisis. We look at their Canada drug strategy. It's great. It says that they want to take a compassionate, integrated, coordinated approach, but no timeline and no plan on how they're going to implement it, and no resources attached to it. That means it's meaningless. It's absolutely useless because it doesn't commit to anything, and it doesn't talk about how they're going to deliver a plan to respond to the crisis that we're in, that every community in our country is in, especially rural Canada, where we know it's very difficult. But when we look at children, when it comes to the state of the report, children it's alarming that children can't get access to the care in most places, and they're chronically underfunded. Over 50% of youth can't get the supports they need. That's absolutely irresponsible and reprehensible. The government needs to be accountable, and they need to take action. This is what we're dealing with right now, is a failure by this Liberal government. And again, the Conservatives before them cut transfers. Their plan is to continue to cut services to Canadians.
So how can the government take action considering the gridlock that's in the House right now?
Oh, they can take action. They can announce commitments. We're still waiting for those commitments. We need the government to act with a sense of urgency. We haven't seen that. They talk big on mental health, but they deliver breadcrumbs. And that's what we continue to get. They don't hold the provinces and territories to account when it comes to the mental health transfers. There's still no permanent funding. It's all temporary funding. And they still haven't laid out a plan on how they're going to achieve parity when it comes to the mental health crisis in Canada, and how they're going to achieve parity with physical health. So again, we're calling on the Liberal government to lay out a plan and talk about how they're going to deliver the resources to support Canadians. People need help right now. Liberals continue to let people down. Conservatives continue to cut when it comes to health care. And we look at the provinces and territories in Canada that are led by Conservative governments. Overall, their health care spending is far less than the national average and far less than our OECD partners, and we're seeing that play out in our communities. You don't have to look far anywhere in Canada to see people under distress and not getting the help they need. Everyone in Canada is impacted by this. No one is left untouched, and there isn't anyone that doesn't have a family member that's struggling. And this is a disservice to our healthcare system. It's clogging up our ER rooms. It's creating backlogs in dental care offices, and clients especially, aren't getting the help that they need and they deserve. Thank you.
Its first long-range missile from the U.S.?
Well, in my opinion, this is long overdue. I mean, Canada's position has always been that Canadian weapons can be used to strike on legitimate military targets in Russia. It's important because that's the only way to ensure that's one of the things that has to happen to ensure that Ukraine wins the war. Ukraine's fight is our fight. And so important that Canada and the United States and Europe and other allies provide Ukraine with support needed until it wins.
Putin has decreased the threshold for using nuclear weapons. What should we make of that? Is he bluffing, or should we take this threat seriously?
I think we should always consider those threats seriously, but I think the reality is if we look at Vladimir Putin's behavior, he uses saber rattling as a tactic to entice appeasement from the West. He invaded Georgia in 2008 and used saber-rattling tactics like this. He invaded Ukraine in 2014 and persuaded the world to stand back while he took a large share of Ukraine. And if we had stood up to Vladimir Putin then and not given into a saber-rattling, then likely the further invasion in 2022 would have never happened. We could have prevented this from happening in the first place. To me, I think what we have to do is soberly and objectively assess whether these threats are real. Always consider them. But I think Vladimir Putin's record is one of a lot of bluffs, a lot of bluster, but the reality is We know that his goal is to dissuade us from supporting Ukraine. We cannot afford to have Ukraine lose, because if Ukraine loses or we give in to his saber rattling, then we will face much greater security threats in the future. If Russia wins, if Russia retains the territory Ukraine has today, then Canadians will be facing Russian aggression, whether it's in Europe or in the Canadian Arctic or somewhere else. So we pay a small price now to help Ukraine win, or a much bigger price later.
So the Prime Minister reacted to Putin's takeover of Crimea in 2015 with a hockey joke. In retrospect, do you think that was a mistake for him to react so flippantly?
I don't know what you're referring to be frank with you. What I do know is that Canada's been a global leader in supporting Ukraine. We've provided $20 billion in support to Ukraine since 2022, and we'll continue to do that. The government of Canada's position, Mr. Trudeau's position, has been that we'll support the Ukrainian people until they win. It's not just the right thing to do, but it's the right thing. It's the right thing for Canada. We need to make sure Ukraine wins this war.
Thank you.
In your view, do you think Ukraine should give up some territory to end this war to Russia?
No, it should not. I think that would be appeasing Russia, and I think that would just lead to further invasions in the future. We know from how Vladimir Putin has invaded Georgia, invaded Ukraine in 2014, that he won't stop at Ukraine. He's told us so. That's how we know that, and he's behaved so. He's invaded other parts of Ukraine and Georgia, etc. So I think either we stop him now, or we will face greater incursions, greater wars into the future. I think pay a small price now, or a much bigger price later. I prefer we pay a small price now and help Ukraine win.
And do you think Minister Boissonnault should resign from cabinet since he made false Indigenous claims?
I won't comment on that. That's a question for Mr. Boissonnault and the Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Prime Minister's recent willingness to accept or work on a definition of anti-Palestinian racism?
I think it's a very welcoming thing, and I did 7 roundtables during this summer. Went from Scarborough all the way up to Vancouver, and I'm very thankful to over 300 people who contributed towards those roundtables, and it is very clear that APR is distinct, and I think it's important that government should recognize it. And I look forward to working with the community and Minister Khera's office.
How close do you expect the definition to be from the 2022 definition put forward by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association?
We will see. The thing is that I am glad that the Prime Minister has said that we need to define it, and I will work with Minister Khera's office and the community to make sure.
Do you think the 2022 definition is a good start, something to build on?
Oh yes, definitely.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Can you talk about Canada's efforts to bring him home and what Canada's doing?
We're aware of the situation. It's a consular case. We know about privacy and obviously.
MacKinnon, est-ce que Randy Boissonnault devrait démissionner à votre avis?
Non.
Non? Vous voulez le garder au cabinet malgré toutes les controverses?
C'est le Premier ministre qui le garde au cabinet.
Minister, just a moment of Canada right now. Are you going to push for binding arbitration?
That's not our intention, though.
Yeah. And how long are you going to let this go out, though? I mean, if it's not your intention now, do you have a red line for that?
We're taking the time with the parties at the table to try and get an agreement.
Is it going to ruin people's Christmas?
We certainly hope not.
Talk to your people.